And now, all the way from the other side of the pond, it's the Tea Party Power Hour with Mark Gillar.
Good day and welcome to the Tea Party Power Hour. This is your host, Mark Gillar. Before we dive into the show in earnest, I just want to remind everybody that if you'd like to subscribe to our newsletter, you can text the word T, that's T-E-A, as in taxed enough already, to 44144. Once again, text the word T to 44144, and you'll stay apprised of all of our most recent guests and breaking news that happened on the show. My very special guest today is Mr. Joeseph Fried. He is a CPA with over 40 years of experience. He's written many books, including How Social Security Picks Your Pocket, Who Really Drove the Economy into the Ditch, Debunked an Auditor Reviews the 2020 Election and the Lessons Learned, and he has a new book out right now called How Elections Are Stolen. We're going to talk about that one a little bit too. Joseph, welcome to the show. Great to have you.
It's great to be with you, Mark. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. You know, I mentioned this to you on the phone the other day. I bought several books about the 2020 election, hoping they would be what this book is, a detailed swing state by swing state review of exactly what happened in each one of those states. This is by far the most complete book on the 2020 election fraud I've seen. So congratulations on putting all this together. Fantastic piece of work.
Well, thanks for the kind words. I really appreciate it.
And it's absolutely 100% true. If anyone wants to be able to discuss the 2020 election and what happened in each one of those swing states and do so with authority, this is the book you need to buy. I assume it's available anywhere good books are sold?
Yeah, it's pretty universal. I don't know if you'll find it in a boutique bookshop because it's not exactly up their alley, if you know what I mean. It's a conservative book. But
right.
But online anywhere.
Sure, Amazon for sure. That's where I got my copies. So,
yeah,
and enjoyed it very much, and did actually manage to finish it before the interview today. So I speak with confidence whenever I say that this is a great book, and I speak with the benefit of having read everything that's in it, and I highly recommend it to just anybody out there who, especially people like me, who love to battle on Twitter with liberals for the fun of it. This will put a lot of them in their place. And speaking of liberals, what I would like to jump into first, Joe, if it's okay with you, is that there are some what I would call, how do we put this, liberal talking points about the election. As someone who fights with liberals on Twitter all the time for the fun of it, I've heard these over and over and over. So I'd like to take 4 of them, add a 5th of my own, and just let you sort of knock these down and put them in context. The first one I hear all the time is the November 3rd election was the most secure in American history, by a gentleman named Krebs. And maybe you can tell us who he is and what you feel about that particular comment.
Oh, I don't feel good about that, man. Christopher Krebs was the head of CISA, the Cyber Infrastructure Security Agency.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a case of the man spreading misinformation by being quiet. And what I mean by that is he would go on one talk show after another, letting people misinterpret what he was saying. His role as head of CISA was to look for cyber threats, mainly from abroad, not from America, but maybe somewhat from within, but not at all to determine if dead people voted or to determine if people were registered properly or if they had phony ballots that were harvested. None of that. And yet people kept saying and citing him as evidence of the cleanest election. And he would sit there. And what's amusing, and I cited, I think, in the book, is that Rand Paul and Rob Portman finally pinned the man down really good in a Senate hearing Rand Paul says to the guy, "You keep saying that, but it's making some of the people on our side kind of upset because you're not really saying that there were no dead people voting or none of this stuff. You're just talking about cyber stuff, right?" And Rand Paul, totally silent, sits there with his arms crossed and doesn't agree with him or say anything. An hour goes by or more, and Rob Portman from Ohio, our senator, I'm in Ohio, and he says, "Well, I want to pick up on what Senator Paul said. You never really responded." And finally, under that kind of pressure, Christopher Krebs acknowledged. He said, "No, we had absolutely nothing to do with any of that. We're into cyber stuff." Well, I can tell you, I was then watching to see what Krebs would do later on television shows, and he went right back to letting them spread that misinformation. So that's my story about Krebs. You shouldn't believe him.
Well, let me go over a short list that you actually have in the book of things that Christopher Krebs said. He said the mail-in ballot applications were fully completed in accordance with state regulations. I don't know how he knows that. He said the signatures on the ballot documents matched signatures on registrations. He said the ballots were authentic and were submitted in a timely manner, that the ballots received were from U.S. citizens. Apparently, he did a citizenship check on every single person that voted, that underage people were not voted, that the people voting were definitely alive, that the people were voting only once and in their proper jurisdiction, that ballots were not being shredded, and that people from all political parties were allowed to observe the processing of the ballot.
Well, to the extent that he said those things, of course, it's baloney. The other thing I say, though, about Krebs, I sort of left out, is the other reason not to believe him is he wasn't that competent, apparently, or his agency, because it turns out after he was fired, a few weeks or months after he was fired, we find out arguably the largest hack in the world's history, the Sunrise hack. It's a supply chain hack, was discovered, not by CISA, by the way, but by a private company. And it was right under his nose for a month. So he didn't even do that right. And then another hack was some Iranian guys who I think were finally caught and prosecuted. They attempted to hack 14 states. They got into one, got 100,000 registration records, and were using it to target Trump. But he didn't catch that, or if he did, he didn't want to report it. So the guy, I question his competence. I question his objectivity.
Okay, so not only does he not know anything about catching election fraud, he doesn't even know how to do his regular job properly, the job he was hired to do.
Joe, I want to talk about Bill Barr in just a minute, but before we do, we have to do a little business with America. Hear that sound? Do you recognize it? It's the sound of silver coins clinking and clanking together. Ever since I've been a kid, I've loved that sound. There's just something about it. The coins you get in change today don't sound like that because they're not made of silver. That's why I'm excited to tell you about a special collection of 99.9% 1-ounce silver coins that honor our 45th president, Donald J. Trump. These beautiful, high-quality coins depict everything from Trump riding down the glass escalator to announce his run for the presidency, to his fight to build a border wall, his efforts to make America energy independent, his battle to keep our monuments from being torn down by the woke left crowd, and that's just a few. Currently, there are around 60 coins to choose from, with 5 new designs on the way between now and Christmas. These Trump coins make the perfect gift for the MAGA patriot on your list. Some of them are available in copper and gold, too. Right now, coins are 20% off. Just enter the promo code SPRING when ordering. But hurry, this offer is subject to cancellation at any time. To learn more, go to TeaPartyPowerHour.com and click on the Trump Coins tab at the top. Once there, click on any coin to see the full collection. Be sure to order yours now. Christmas will be here before you know it.
You're listening to Mark Goulart. He explained the way things really are.
we are back. Joe, let's pick up where we left off.
Another statement that's out there in a really big way, and I can't even tell you how many times I've encountered this one on Twitter. It's by everyone's favorite AG, William Barr. We have not seen fraud on a scale that could have affected a different outcome in the election.
Yeah,
All yours.
I used to like that man. I really thought he was a good straight shooter, and my opinion has dramatically changed for a lot of reasons. Mostly because he's going all around now, letting people, again, just like Christopher Krebs, he's letting people take a ridiculous statement that has no meaning. And here's why it has no meaning. The election was on November 3rd, 2020. 6 days later, on the 9th, William Barr wrote to he had a little 16-member election task force within the Department of Justice. And he wrote a memo to them. It was a very reasonable memo. It said, "You have my authority to investigate any allegations of fraud that come your way if they're substantial, if they're credible, and they could affect the election." That's it. Well, the head of this little agency, God knows what kind of lefties are in this agency, because the head of the agency, Richard Pilger, resigned in a huff that very day. He said, "My high ethics. I have a cherished award for high ethics," he says. He says, "They won't permit me to participate, so I quit." 4 days later, the rest of the group sends a memo, and this is not reported anywhere. I mean, it was reported one place and then killed. They sent a letter to, or a communication to William Barr saying, "We want you to rescind your memo because there is no fraud. We can't find any fraud." So if there was an investigation under William Barr, it lasted no more than 4 days. And a couple of weeks later, he issues his famous proclamation that we found no fraud. Talk about fraud. There's the fraud. William Barr is the fraud. Why would he say that? And why would he let people to this day keep using that silly statement?
I don't know.
That.
I'm with you. You know, I was impressed with the guy at first. When he came out and said that Trump was being spied upon, I thought, well, you know what? This guy definitely a step up from the previous AG. But since then, it's frankly been all downhill. Now, another thing about Barr, and I think you pointed this out in the book. In fact, I know you did. You said that he may not necessarily be the best guy to look at white-collar crime. And when it came to elections, he seems to think that if the paper ballots matched what the computer said, that's all he needed to know that there was a legit election. The idea of fake ballots being used for backfill to match the computer numbers apparently isn't something that he considers. So let's talk about whether Bill Barr would have been the best guy to do an investigation, even if he had chosen to do one.
Well, I just don't think, there's been reports. I think William McSwain from Pennsylvania said that he attempted to report potential fraud to Barr, and Barr simply said, "Oh, give it to the Attorney General of Pennsylvania, who is a big lefty who hated Trump's guts." And so that's just like killing it. So I don't think there's any, and there are other reports as well, but I don't think William Barr had any interest. Something happened between him and Trump where there's some horrible animosity, I guess. And all I can say is William Barr, I'm guessing that he hated Trump so much at the end that he just wasn't going to participate in finding fraud or in reporting accurately anymore.
Yeah, I wonder if it didn't have anything to do with Trump being frustrated about Barr not wanting to do anything regarding Hunter Biden. Who knows? But definitely some animosity there, to be sure. So when it comes to looking at an election, and we're going to look at a couple more talking points in a second, though, because I think this is really important. What should an audit consist of? Because again, we just discussed that William Barr thinks you count the paper ballots, and if it matches what's in the computer, you certified the election. So as a CPA with over 40 years of experience and someone who's looked closely at all these swing states, what should an audit entail? I know you're big on canvassing, but I'll let you tell the whole story.
Well, there's a whole lot of things. Hopefully you have a cooperative state government, because if the state government doesn't value voter integrity, you're not going to get anywhere. But of course, in America, we should have voter ID. Do you know there's 47 countries in Europe? Europe is generally considered to be to the left of the United States, but every single country of Europe, without exception, has hard voter ID. I'm not talking signatures, I mean real ID. And except for one or maybe two, it's photo ID. They don't mess around. And I think they're actually, from some of the things I've read, they're a little bewildered at how we could have an election where I heard somebody saying the other day, Cleta Mitchell, she's saying it's almost like we have unsupervised elections now. No ID, no signatures. You can't even have observers. In Pennsylvania, the Supreme Court in 2020 stepped in to say those Republican observers in Philadelphia County have to stay back at least 15 to 18 feet. A lower court had said 6 feet, which was reasonable. But they said 15 to, so in other words, there was no observation. Mm-hmm. There was no signature matching. There was no ID. It was an unsupervised election. And then you had, what did you have in the movie 2000 Mules? True the Vote reported they estimated up to 275,000 in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania, were harvested. And by the way, a lot of people, boy, I feel sorry for that organization, Catherine Engelbrecht and Greg Phillips, because, they're wonderful. And it's such a smear. I've read so many fact checks that are such baloney. Let me start with this one. If you were a fact checker trying to fact check whether or not the possibility of locating a harvester in a cell phone could be accurate, the first place you'd go to is a website called gps.gov. That's the official website. And that website, which nobody cited that I read, nobody bothered to cite that one. They send an email to a left-wing professor in a college and said, I actually saw Reuters actually sent one to a political science professor. Now, I know they have the word science in their title, but they're not scientists. These are guys who study politics. That's the whole profession of political science. Right. And the guy writes back, it's only good to about 40 feet. He probably Googled that and said, how accurate is my car GPS? Well, GPS.gov says it's typically 16 feet, less if you have you're in tall buildings, but is accurate as centimeters if you use boosters or multiple sources. Well, guess what? Greg Phillips is right there in video saying we used 3 signals at once to get our accuracy to 30. He used 39 inches as his marker. Nobody reported in their fact checks that they were using multiple signals, that he had it down to 39 inches. Nobody mentioned GPS.gov. These were all left-wing smear political fact checks. So that's what,
Oh, I think I've seen numerous people on television, including Republicans, saying, well, that was probably just somebody, those were people driving home from work, and because it's not very accurate, they were just driving down the street and driving past these drop boxes. But you know what's interesting, and I always like to ask liberals this whenever I'm fighting with them on Twitter, which, again, is almost like a hobby for me. I'll ask them, isn't it interesting that the geofencing technology wasn't accurate enough to determine these mules, but it was accurate enough to arrest people on J6.
Yeah,
and they don't really have an answer for that. They do not have an answer for that. And it's kind of funny because I told you I I had a list of these talking points from the left that I got from your book, and I had one more. The one more that I was going to mention was the geofencing and True to Vote. Those are very good people. They, like so many other people that have come forward, they have been harassed, they have been sued. What's happening to them is not right. They've even been in jail, if I'm not mistaken. So it's just absolutely crazy what happens if you come out and try to tell the truth. And we can say the same thing for the postal workers that came forward, and we can talk about that a little bit too. But let me jump back to something real quick. I said there were going to be 4 talking points that were major. This one is the king of the talking points. I can tell you I've heard this at least 100 times on Twitter. Trump and his allies have lost 60 election fights in court. And I'm embarrassed to say this, but someone that I really respected threw that at me. Oh, Trump's lost 60 times in court. There's nothing to this. First of all, as I've told people on Twitter, there's a difference between losing a court case and having a judge punt the ball out of his courtroom or her courtroom because they don't want to deal with it. And you mentioned the reasons that were used to kick a lot of these cases out of court. These weren't victories for the left. These weren't losses for Trump. These were merely processing issues, versus substance issues. So why don't you talk about, and I know you've got a website you can reference, exactly how many court cases there were and how many of them were just things being kicked out for jurisdiction, being moot, lashing, whatever, versus the others.
Well, I used, there's different people who assembled the court case records, and they're all a little different because you see, what is a court case? Is it the lower court, and then is it a second case when you get to the appeals court, and is the Supreme Court a third case or not, and so forth. But I use one that I think is excellent. It's Promoting American Election Integrity. It's a website by John Draz. He runs that. And what I like about that website is that every single court case, you can click on it, and it references to MIT, Stanford, I think, synopsis of the case. So it isn't just taking John Draz's word for it. He's backing it up with lawyers who are assessing how the case was handled and how it was dismissed. Now, yes, you're right. There's something called latches, which means you should have filed sooner, so we're throwing the case out. There's mootness, there's standing, there's jurisdiction is another one. These are the grounds for throwing a case out without hearing it. And according to the tally that I use, there were 92 cases. All were on process except for 30. Trump won 22 of the 30. He lost 8. And of the 8 he lost, frankly, when you read the cases, they're not biggies exactly. Now, I will qualify what I just said to be fair. Some of those ones he lost on process were probably not very good, strong cases. Sidney Powell, I think she has a lot of fight, and I understand her. She did a lot of good things in her Michigan case, for example. But she also got into the weeds with this machine stuff, and I think she sort of lost her focus, and it was a sloppy case. And I think if they had tried it on the merits, it would have lost, but it wasn't lost on the merits, okay? And there's a Lynn Wood. Remember Lynn Wood? He went a little off the deep end there. And so there was another. So I'm not trying to say that every case that's lost on process would have won, but a lot of those would have won if they, maybe the vast majority. So it's very deceptive when they talk about the 60 cases. I don't know where they came up with 60 anyway, but Trump did very well. And if I don't have them right in the top of my head, but of the 8 that he lost, 3 had to do with Pennsylvania, and he should not have lost. I mean, one was about the observers. You're not allowed to have observers close. I think he wanted observers in all of the places where they were processing. And the wise judges said, no, you don't have to have observers. Let these people do it in private. Well, I mean, that's not the kind of ruling I think most sensible, fair people would have made. So he lost some that he should have won among the 8 that he actually lost on the merits. But yeah, this canard we keep hearing about the 60 lost cases is baloney. It's not good at all. But I noticed that I sort of digressed because you were asking me what could be done, and then I got into this through the vote and the ballot harvesting. So let me rattle off real quickly before I start bloviating anymore. Some of the things that could be done, there's so many that I can't really hit them all, but I would have, for example, a rejection rate trigger. It's astonishing, Mark, but in Georgia, their rejection rate from 2016 to 2020 dropped to 1/18th. And that made a difference of 78,000 ballots that were accepted that would have been under the old standards rejected. Now, Trump lost that election by 11,008. So this is multiple times, 78,000, many times more than the 11,008 by which Trump. And that is really what it ends up saying is this, that it wasn't the people of Georgia who voted in Biden. It was the workers within the election processing centers, the middle managers, just like they did with Kerry Lake, by the way. Just like Kerry Lake, the middle managers threw the election to Biden by allowing a lot of suspect ballots to be counted. But here's the kicker. If anybody thinks, because some people will say, well, they had a consent decree that eliminated the ballot suppression. That was Stacey Abrams' work. No, it's not that simple. Because in Fulton County, the deep blue Democrat county of Fulton, very large county, it's mostly Atlanta, the rate dropped not to 1/18th, it dropped to 1 divided by 128. In other words, it dropped to nothing. Now, all of a sudden, we're supposed to feel that the marginalized citizens, because 62% minority, and we've been brainwashed by Democrats to believe that they can't do paperwork. That's why we can't have ID. But those marginalized citizens in Fulton somehow were 7 times more accurate than the rest of Georgia. How does that work? In other words, any real auditor would say that's got to be investigated. And you know what? That they're trying to investigate it. And so Garland Favorito, with voter GA, has almost since the day of the election, has been trying to get his hands on 147,000 mail-in ballots from Fulton County. And you know who's been blocking him every inch of the way? Brad Raffensperger, Republican Secretary of State. Yeah. So I can't blame it all on the Democrats. You know what? And I tried to tell this.
I was going to say.
I was just going to say that as an auditor,
Raffensperger.
I'm sorry.
The guy that Trump had his phone call with. So I just want to throw that in there. That's he sabotaged. You see, that whole meeting with Trump was supposed to be to set up a meeting where Trump's CPA and his attorneys would sit down with the people of the Secretary of State's office and work it out. The next day, they were going to have a meeting after that phone call, the very next day. And Raffensperger sabotaged that meeting by leaking out that phone call, which blew it all up. So, much for that. Anyway, that's why I would recommend there should be a rejection rate trigger. And what I mean by that is that if any state or county has a rejection rate that collapses like to 1/18th or 1 divided by 128, that should trigger an audit because something's wrong there. You can't have that. So you got to have ID. You got to go back to limiting mail-in ballots to people who are traveling abroad or who are incapacitated and give a reason. You can't just indiscriminately mail out anymore. Make harvesting a felony in all cases. That's something that has to be done. Could that be done at the federal level, or would each state have to make that law?
Well, that's a great question, Mark. That's got to ultimately will have to be done at the federal level. Now, this is an interesting issue because a lot of Republicans are opposed to federalizing our elections. But I got news for them. Every time the Democrats get hold of a state, as they did in Michigan, they take it off the table. Michigan is as likely to go Republican in the future as California now. I hate to depress your audience by saying that, but as soon as they got control of all parts of the government, they right away put through a constitutional amendment that is obscene. I think I have it on my website as a whole piece. If somebody wanted to go to joefriedcpa.substack. But what they did was they made it so that nobody is allowed anymore to audit their elections except the Secretary of State. Oh, isn't that nice? So the Democrat Secretary of State is the only one that gets to see ballots, that gets to audit ballots. It's out of anybody's home. They also enshrined the ability to vote without ID forever and ever. And they did a bunch of other things. I itemized them all, but basically they gutted all the security controls. And you can't change it. It's in their Constitution now. So I don't think we're going to – I hope – all I can say, some of these states are off the table unless there's a massive, massive, massive red wave. Maybe that'll get us back Nevada. Maybe that'll get us back Michigan. Maybe that'll get us back Pennsylvania. Otherwise, those three might be gone. So I hope not, but that's the way it looks.
What would be the options as far as having the Supreme Court weigh in on this? I mean, it just seems to me that some of these things might be compatible with their state constitution, especially since they just changed it, but not with America's constitution, not with the federal laws.
Yeah.
I mean, it just seems to me the one place we still have an advantage is sometimes on the Supreme Court, and that just doesn't sit right. It doesn't seem to me that you could say no one can audit our ballots. I've always heard, no offense, you're from Ohio, but I actually read an article once where somebody said, Ohio allowed same-day registration for voting, and they joked that you could literally in Ohio walk in and say, "Hi, I'm Schmitty, and I live on Park Bench number 5, and I want to vote." And they'd say, "Yeah, okay, here's a ballot." So it's not surprising that this happened there, but
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, we've cleaned. Things are tighter in Ohio now. I'm proud to say that if you want to get a mail-in ballot, you have to apply for it, and guess what? You have to present an ID with that application. And then when you get your ballot back in Ohio, and you sign it and fill it out, and you send it in, again you have to have ID with it. So that's why we're becoming a Republican red state. I'm telling you, anywhere where there's voter ID, you tend to have a Republican state, and it's very telling. Why some of these states are moving to unsupervised elections? And that's what we have. Well, there's other things to do. There's so many things, Mark. One is that I wasn't even aware about until recently. Did you read the story of Jesse Morgan and the tractor trailer?
Absolutely.
Somewhere in there. Yeah. Well, and this was an epiphany for me because all of a sudden I realized I had overlooked something. Jesse Morgan, very credible. You talked about some post office guys. Well, he's sort of a post office guy. He worked for a subcontractor that would drive the big rigs with mail. And he reported way back before the election, by the way, this is back in October of 20, before the election, that he didn't understand some things, strange things that were happening. He drove from eastern New York State all the way into Pennsylvania, and he went to Lancaster. I can't remember the city name, but he went to one.
Was it Harrisburg?
Probably Harrisburg, where he ended up. Anyway, he went to one city, and they told him, we don't want you to unload. He waited for 6 hours. Nobody would talk to him. They finally said, just go down to Scranton, I think it was. And so he said, okay. So he goes to Scranton. he unhooks up his trailer, and the next morning when he wakes up and he goes to hook it up, it disappears. And he said the funny thing is, when I looked inside, it looked like hundreds of thousands of filled in ballots. And I'm thinking, then he started to question himself, and he says this all on video. I'm scrambling it up, but if you want a good accounting, you can find it. He said, I was starting to wonder, what the heck am I taking so many ballots from New York to Pennsylvania for? And why would I not see the ballots were for the first city he went to, but they told him to leave. And then when he parks it, it disappears. And then he can't understand that. Well, guess what? They did an investigation. A year and a half later, the post office inspector general said, we did notice that 650,000 ballots were printed by a Rochester printer, and but they didn't think they had anything to do with Jesse Morgan, except for one problem. Neither the printer could not explain how their 650,000 ballots, 200,000 for Chester County and 450,000 for Philadelphia, how did they go from Rochester to Chester and to Philadelphia? How did they use their trucks, or did they put them in the mail stream in Rochester? And they said, we don't know. This is a year and a half later. And then, incredibly, the post office said, we checked our records. We don't know either. So neither side, they somehow magically moved from the New York to the Philadelphia area. Chester's in Philadelphia too, really. And neither can explain how it happened. Well, the obvious possibility is they were in Jesse Morgan's truck. And what it occurred to me that, we overlook this, but the chain of custody has to start with the printer, because in a lot of places, the printers are filling out the ballots, they're folding them, they're putting them in envelopes, and sometimes they take them right to the post office, and sometimes they send them to the election center. But we don't know if somebody in the printing office is in cahoots with one of the political parties. They could be this could be a huge source of abuse, and it's not being tracked right now. So this might be the explanation for Jesse Morgan.
I think it's important to point out that some of the information that's, or I should say misinformation being put out by the left, is that this guy recanted. And what they're doing is they're mixing up two stories. There was one gentleman who talked about ballots being backdated, and he was said to have recanted, but he came out and said he never recanted. But what's interesting, but I think it's important for people to understand that there are two postal stories, one involving the trailer, which I think is very damning to anyone who tries to claim there was no fraud in the election. And the second one was the postal worker who came forward and said that ballots received late were being backdated. So can you tell us about the second postal case, just so people understand the difference?
I'm thinking there actually is a third one, but I don't think it's the one you're referring to. Ethan Peace, a guy named Ethan Peace, very credible. By the way, none of the three in my book, I think there's three, has recanted. That is baloney. There was one who briefly, he even said on the record, I've been told that if I sign this statement recanting, it'll save my ass. So he signed it, and then the next day I think he recanted it. But Ethan Peace is very credible. He said that two separate postal workers told him that they were bringing 100,000 ballots to be backdated, and he's never recanted that. Nobody's ever shown why he would say that, what his motive was. It wasn't particularly political. So I don't, frankly, there's a lot of people I've talked to about this who will say that the Postal Service has a Democrat history going back decades. They've maybe a century. The post office is unionized. It's very left wing, and I've got to tell you, I think that they may be the biggest component in ballot harvesting there is. If you think about it, if you're a mailman and you're going to, let's say you have an apartment building on your route, and you know damn well I'm putting, here's a little mail slot in the lobby where they have all the mailboxes, and I'm putting in this ballot for so-and-so, and I've got 3 others, and he's sliding them in. Well, he can just hold on to those extra 3 that he knows that people move. They know who's moved and who's living there right now.
Right.
They all know that. And he can just keep those 3 because they're worth money. And maybe there may be like a postal worker who's going around to other postal workers, collecting them all and giving them $10 each or $20 each for those things. So frankly, that's not proof, of course, but I'm skeptical. These 3 guys are on record. They're on video. They have not recanted. They're very credible. By the way, as we're talking, I'm recalling, you're right. It was Jesse Morgan drove to Harrisburg, but he also had a trip to make to Lancaster. And here's why it was so strange. He had a little bit of mail in the front of the trailer that was for Lancaster, and then most of the 90% of the mail was for Harrisburg, his first stop. Now, if you think about it, you can't get to the Lancaster mail because it's blocked by all this Harrisburg mail. Mm-hmm. So he was befuddled. He said, I'm in Harrisburg. I got all this Harrisburg mail. It has to come out before I go to my next stop. So why aren't you letting me take it out? And they wouldn't. So he goes to Lancaster. The trailer disappears. And it's a year and a half later, they claim, he was mixed up. He was identifying the wrong trailer. Who cares if he had the right ID number for it? They never really, by the way, refuted anything substantial he said. They didn't refute that he made the trip to Harrisburg. They didn't refute that he drove then to Lancaster. They said they didn't recall. I thought that was so interesting. Workers couldn't recall telling him to go to Lancaster. Does the post office just go by verbal recollections, or do they actually have a written record? I mean, it's crazy. So
I agree with you 100%. And again, when we talk about fake things being said by liberals on social media, one of the things we most often hear is that the guy driving the tractor trailer recanted his story, that the guy who talked about the backdating recanted their story, and from what you're telling us, neither one of those things is true. I want to definitely get into at least a couple of the swing states. I want to talk about Georgia, especially in light of the recent indictments, and Pennsylvania. But because I uploaded this clip, and I definitely want my listeners to hear it on this show, although I can already tell we're going to have you back. I want to play this little clip from Detroit, a Detroit training center training poll workers and teaching them how to deal with provisional ballots. And the clip kind of speaks for itself. It's a 1-minute clip. I'm going to play it, and then I'm going to ask you to comment on it, okay? Here we go.
Okay.
Your chairperson can issue him what type of ballot? Provisional. A provisional envelope. Why? Where's it going? Not in the tabulator. It's going in an envelope, right? We have how many days? 6. So what is the Department of Elections going to do with it? Destroy it. Challengers and poll watchers. They have to wear a mask and they have to stay 6 feet. That's important because they can come behind your table. But if you don't have 6 feet, they can't come back there. Any questions?
For 60 back, they really good vision. They can actually.
Exactly. If they got really good vision, or they brought their binoculars. 6 feet. That's the rule, right? And you are entitled to your 6 feet.
Okay, so to unpack this, we've got her admitting that they're going to throw the provisional ballots away, and is saying they've got to give you, they being the poll watchers, have to give you 6 feet. And there was a little line in there about, if you don't have 6 feet, they can't go back there. That sounded to me like she was instructing them to position their tables against a wall so that there wasn't 6 feet between the wall and the back of the table so that they could tell them. And, of course, in some cases it was much worse than that. They were making poll watchers stand on the other side of the room. In some cases it was 18 feet, but in some cases it was ridiculous. You couldn't have seen anything with the telescope. So what, if anything, happened with this? I mean, I'm sure they probably went after the guy that had the recording and published it, but what happened?
Well, Dana Nessel, the Attorney General of Michigan, went after that guy and threatened him very severely. I don't know how he still has it up. I think he sort of it got out there and he divorced himself from it, so they can't hold it against him. But yeah, they did nothing as far as I know. I don't know if they disciplined that woman or, frankly, she should have been fired because that's not a joking matter. And I don't know if she was even joking, frankly. I think she was telling them the truth. But, you're talking about Michigan, and there was a whistleblower, Jesse Jacob, a 30-year, I think she worked 30 years, almost 30 years for the city of Detroit. She's a black woman. This is not your typical white supremacist. She is a worker for the city, and what she said was even more devastating. She said, at one point, I'm going off my memory, I'm sitting here with 70 or 80 people, she said, and we're being told to backdate the mail-out packages. They were sending out packages of mail-in ballots and to backdate them. And then she said separately in a sworn affidavit, by the way, all of this is sworn, that we were then told to backdate on November 4th, the day after the election, to backdate the mail-in ballots that we're receiving so that they would be counted. And she said we were being told to not look for any deficiencies in the ballots, such as not having a real address or something, and to not check signatures. Now, you said, well, Michigan, by the way, didn't even check signatures on mail-in ballots, but they were still supposed to check them in person, but they didn't even do that. So it's a devastating indictment, but it's kind of always interesting to me. She would be a celebrated, if we reverse the politics, Jesse Jacob would be exactly the type of celebrated whistleblowers the Democrats would love. Here's a veteran city worker. She's black. She's very credible, articulate, and she's saying these terrible things happen. And by the way, you don't make a statement that I'm sitting here with 70, 80 people and they're telling me this, because those 70 to 80 people could back her up or they could disprove her. Well, right. They didn't. Actually, what happened is, this is another one of those cases. She was part of a case called the Constantino versus the city of Detroit case. It's another one where the judge just threw it out. Jesse Jacob was asking for an investigation of this. And she said, let's, if necessary, an injunction against certifying until we investigate this. And the judge threw it out. So, nobody cares. She's not considered a real whistleblower by the left, by the legacy media, because she's on the wrong side politically, I guess.
Right.
Or they perceive her to be. I don't even know if she is really a conservative in any way.
It's interesting that you say that, because I've talked to a number of African-American conservatives, and they've all told me that the racism they've experienced in their lives has come at the hands of liberals, or from the mouths of liberals, because liberals, especially white liberals, think that all African Americans should be Democrats, and whenever an African American isn't willing to let someone else tell them how to think, suddenly they become a problem, and they become the target of a lot of racist abuse. So now I can't believe how fast this hour is going, but I definitely want to touch on Georgia and that phone call to the Secretary of State, simply because, we recently had Fani Willis bring forward the indictment against Donald Trump. And I think it's very important to discuss exactly what went on in Georgia, how many potential votes there were in Georgia that could have been fraudulent. And I'll just let you take it from here. Tell us about the phone call, and tell us what you think of this indictment that's been brought forward by Fani Willis.
Yeah, well, this is, of all the indictments, this might be, it's almost like a comedy routine. I'm going to read real quick. I know we're running short. a couple of the 161 acts of racketeering. She has 161 acts of racketeering. That's the RICO stuff. And here's one of them. Complete. This is complete. On or about the 21st day of November 2020, Mark Randall Meadows sent a text message to United States Representative Scott Perry from Pennsylvania and stated, quote, "Can you send me the phone number for the speaker and the leader of the Pennsylvania signature? POTUS wants to chat with them," end quote. This was an overt act of furtherance of the conspiracy.
Oh, wow.
So getting a phone number is, so that's an act of conspiracy.
Did she catch
Here's
that,
another
Trump?
one.
I was going to ask if she caught Trump returning a video to Blockbuster late. I mean, that's the same kind of.
Well, even better than that. Here's the next one. It's shorter and better. Quote, this is the whole thing. On or about the third day of December 2020, Donald John Trump caused to be tweeted from the Twitter account of Real Donald Trump. Quote, Georgia hearing is now on OAN News, comma, amazing, end quote. This was an overt act in furtherance of the conspiracy. So watching TV, you didn't know that racketeers use watching TV and talking about it as a means of doing their criminal acts, did you?
I did not know that, and I also did not know that anyone who had made it through law school would do something this ridiculous. I mean, all I can say is that all of these indictments are absolutely ridiculous. I mean, you go to New York with Alvin Bragg, and you're talking about a situation where the statute of limitations had run out. As far as it being, he's trying to extend that by saying that the misdemeanor was actually done in order to help commit a felony, which is nonsense because the FEC had looked at it, the Mueller team had looked at it, the DOJ had looked at it. In fact, even Bragg himself had looked at it at one point and decided there was no there. It was a big nothing burger.
Yep.
But then later decided to go on. I mean, it's so upsetting to see the justice system perverted this way in order to go after one man. And even though this is a civil case, you look at what happened with E. Jean Carroll in New York, they actually passed a law to extend the statute of limitations so that E. Jean Carroll could bring this lawsuit against Donald Trump. And at the same time, she ripped the story, she ripped her plot off an episode of Law and Order, even using the same department store name that was used in Law and Order and the same location and the same location within the department store, the dressing room for the rape. It's absolutely ridiculous what's going on.
I hadn't heard that. Heard that, Mark. Hey, on this, let me just tell people, because we won't be able to get into all of it. I have an article on American Thinker called Fannie's 15 Minutes of Fame. And I get into the numbers, because the numbers don't support her, the numbers of supposedly unsupported claims that Trump was making. But here's the part I gotta say real quick here. This is devastating. It's 1960. You've heard about the Hawaii problem. Well, they actually have a copy of those Democrat certificates. Now, these are certificates. I could use the word fake. That's what they would say to Donald Trump, right? These are certificates by uncertified people who are pretending to be certified, and there's no qualification. It doesn't say this is a nomination, or this is an alternative certificate, or this is just a contingent certificate. No, it says without qualification that they are the, quote, duly and legally qualified and appointed electors for president and vice president, and they were certified by the executive of Hawaii. Well, that's not true. It's all right there, and this is going to be a big problem for Fannie. How is she going to get around that if they did it themselves? That's exactly what they're trying to chop. Now, they distinguish it in one way. They say, oh, yeah, but it was still under contention then. Well, it was still under, all these 6 sweepstakes were under contention right up to January 6th. That's just baloney. They're all under contention the same way as it was in 1960, where the Democrats had something under contention, and they didn't want to lose an opportunity to have the slate of electors ready, so they got it ready in case they needed it, just as Trump was trying to do. Same thing.
Real quick, tell us about the new book coming out, and then just give us a brief review and tell us what it's about.
Yeah.
And I will have you back a second time to talk about the new book.
Okay, great. Yeah, the new book came about because I've been on radio shows and podcasts, and people keep ending it and say, "Well, what do we do now?" And I figure, well, I have a book that has 23 short sections. They're 4 to 7 pages each. Each one describes an election weakness that we have that has to be fixed. And I try to come up with the best recommendations I can. Some of them are really tough. But here's some off the top of my head I would give you. First of all, one thing that could be, it's really tough with the bad guys, and I mean the people who don't believe in election integrity run the state because they'll fight you. But one thing you can do, even with the bad guys, is offer rewards. In most of these states, even the Democrat states, harvesting ballots is still illegal. Sometimes a felony, sometimes a misdemeanor. So what I suggest you do is offer a $10,000 reward or something. Say if you have information that leads to the conviction of a ballot harvester in this state, it's $10,000. Now the Democrats will run to court, of course, and somehow say that suppresses or it's racist or some crazy thing. But they always do that. You just assume it. I would also have public announcements saying to people months in advance of the election, if somebody approaches you and asks you for your ballot, remember it's illegal. By the way, I looked at 10 for this book. I expanded my swing states to 10, and all but one, it's still illegal to harvest a ballot. So even though the Democrats in those states don't enforce those rules, you can force the issue by telling people it's illegal and offering that reward. I don't know if you're familiar with Jay Valentine, but he runs a group called Omega for America. Here's something to give you hope. This man with his company is going around to all of the swing states, and he's trying to clean up the registration list. He's finding tons of people, homeless people voting and people from parking lots and all this stuff, ridiculous things like 50 people living in a tiny apartment, supposedly. And he's trying to put a lot of pressure on people because he's a cyber expert. He's got this super fractal programming that he claims is super fast, like 1,000 times faster than anything else. And he's already had some real success in a couple states. He claims, and I don't know if it's true or not, that Wisconsin has a Republican senator, possibly only because they had been cleaning up the registration back then. Another, I can give you one more if we have time. A lot of people are frustrated because the prosecutors don't want to investigate things. Don't forget that every county's got a sheriff, and some of those sheriffs are boiling mad at what they see in the city. They see guys like Alvin Bragg and abusing things, and they would like to do something. They can investigate too. They can't prosecute, but they can, and that's exactly what happened, by the way, in 2020 in Wisconsin. I think it was Sheriff Smalling investigated this nursing home abuse, and he cracked open a really big scandal of, people practically comatose who were voting in the election. And so don't forget the sheriff. That's another thing that can be done. But anyway, those are a few of the suggestions in that book, and there's a lot more. And if you have me back, I'll be glad to get through them.
I will have you back, and we will go through that. And that particular book is entitled
How Elections Are Stolen.
Gotcha.
So,
and I have some suggestions too. I'm interested in seeing every single voter have to vote in person on election day. We need a retinal scan, fingerprints, and We need to have lancets where they can prick their finger and sign their name in blood so we can do a DNA test if we have to. So that's where I'm going.
I like that.
Yeah, that's where I'm going with it. But, Joe, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today. This was extremely informative. I think we have given conservatives something they can use to answer and correct their liberal friends who keep spreading all this disinformation. And I highly recommend the book. I've got my copy on Amazon. I finished it this weekend, and I've got to tell you, I consider myself somebody who's pretty up on the issues, but I learned a lot of stuff that I did not know. And I feel that I have a lot more weapons in my armamentarium to go out and do battle and convince people that 2020 was, in fact, a fraudulent election and the victory was stolen from Donald Trump. So, Joe, thanks once again for being on the show. We're going to have you back real soon to talk about your new book, and I look forward to that as well.
Oh, thank you for having me, Mark. It's been a pleasure. I really appreciate it.
I feel the same way. I can't remember when we've unpacked more information in a shorter period of time. Thanks for being on the show, Joe.
You've been listening to the Tea Party Power Hour with Mark Gillar.